My name is Solenne Hart. I was 31 when I learned that grief has a smell: rain-soaked lilies, old churchwood, and the particular staleness of a suit that's been pressed for an occasion no one wanted. I remember standing outside the funeral home 2 hours early, smoothing the same wrinkle out of my dress over and over, though it had long since surrendered. My father had died on a Tuesday. Quietly, in his sleep, the doctor said, as if that made it gentler. I hadn't slept properly since. My husband, Marcus, had promised to drive separately and meet me there, something about a work call he couldn't move. I remember thinking, even then, that grief makes you generous with excuses. You let people off easily because you don't have room left to be suspicious. My sister, Adele, arrived before I did. She always arrived before everyone, in every sense: first to speak, first to be noticed, first to be forgiven. She hugged me too long at the entrance, the way people do when they want witnesses to their tenderness. "You look exhausted," she said, brushing a piece of lint from my shoulder that wasn't there. Inside, the room was full of flowers we couldn't afford and relatives who hadn't visited Dad in years. I sat in the front pew alone, my hands folded over a program with his photograph, the one from his fishing trip, squinting into a sun that no longer existed for him. Marcus texted. Almost there. Save me a seat. I did. I saved him a seat beside me, the way I had saved him a seat at every important moment of my life since I was 24 years old and believed devotion was something you earned through patience. The service began without him. The priest spoke of stewardship and quiet men who loved without spectacle. I thought of my father teaching me to change a tire in the rain, refusing to let me feel helpless even once. Halfway through the second hymn, I heard the door. I turned, already forming my relieved smile. It wasn't just Marcus in the doorway. It was Marcus and Adele, arriving together, though Adele had been sitting 3 rows behind me the entire time. I didn't understand yet. I only felt the small, cold click of something shifting into place, the kind of feeling you get right before you remember a name you'd forgotten, except this was the opposite. This was the beginning of forgetting who I thought my life was. After the service, there was a car arranged to take immediate family to the cemetery, a black limousine my father would have hated for its vulgarity and loved for the joke of it. I remember him once saying, "Solenne, don't ever let anyone put me in anything shinier than my truck." We'd compromised. It was matte black. I climbed in first, numb, still holding the funeral program like it was something that could be repaired if I held it carefully enough. My mother sat across from me, already asleep from grief and sedatives. Adele was meant to ride with her husband, Theo, in the second car. She didn't. The door opened again, and Marcus stepped in, not from the parking lot where I'd left him searching for a black tie, but from the passenger side of the limo itself, where he'd apparently been sitting the entire 10 minutes I was inside grieving my father with a saved seat beside me. He didn't step out of nervousness. He stepped out like a man surfacing from something he'd been submerged in for a while, adjusting his collar, avoiding my eyes with a specific carefulness of someone who has rehearsed avoiding your eyes. Adele followed a second later, smoothing her dress the exact way I had smoothed mine outside the funeral home 2 hours earlier, except her wrinkle, I understood now, was different. Hers wasn't grief. Hers was concealment. Nobody said anything. My mother slept through it. The driver adjusted his mirror. I looked at Marcus's hands I had held through 4 apartments, 2 miscarriages, and 1 long winter when his father was dying too, and I asked for nothing, offered everything. His fingers were doing the thing they did when he lied, tapping once against his thigh, like punctuation. "Traffic," he said, though I hadn't asked. I didn't respond. I looked out the window instead, at the procession of cars behind us, black and glinting under a colorless sky, carrying my father toward the one thing none of us could argue him out of. I thought, I will bury my father today, and something else, quietly, in the same afternoon. I didn't cry in the limo. I have wondered since if that unsettled them more than tears would have. Silence, I was learning, could be its own kind of evidence. Grief has a strange mercy. It postpones other pain, politely, like a guest waiting its turn. I buried my father on a Thursday. I didn't ask Marcus a single question until the following Monday, not because I lacked courage, but because some truths deserve to be approached slowly, the way you'd walk towards something wounded, so it doesn't bolt before you understand what's broken. In that gap of days, I noticed things I'd trained myself not to notice. The way Adele's calls to Marcus had increased over the past year, always described as just checking on you both. The way Marcus had started closing his laptop a half-second faster when I entered rooms. The way our marriage, once loud with argument and laughter both, had gone quiet in a way I'd mistaken for maturity. I found myself standing in our kitchen on Sunday night, holding a mug of tea I wasn't drinking, watching Marcus pretend to read a message on his phone he'd already read 4 times. Was it Adele in a limo? I finally asked. Not a question. A door, open just wide enough. He didn't deny it immediately, which told me more than a denial would have. He told me it started small. He told me grief makes people reach for whoever is closest. He told me I had been somewhere else since my father got sick, as though my absence had a shape he could point to and blame, rather than a cause he was standing directly inside of. I didn't shout. I surprised myself with how little I wanted to. What I felt instead was a strange, clean clarity, the kind you feel after a fever breaks, when the world looks the same but sounds different. How long? I asked. 14 months, he said, and something in me quietly recalculated an entire section of my life, the birthday dinner, the anniversary trip, the night I cried in his arms about my father's diagnosis while I now understood he had already begun leaving. I didn't ask him to leave that night. Asked him to sleep in the guest room. I needed, more than confrontation, an inventory of what was true, what I had built alone, and what I still had left standing. I work as a financial analyst, a profession built on finding the truth inside numbers that don't want to confess it. People assume the job is about spreadsheets. It's really about patience, about noticing the one figure that doesn't match its neighbors and refusing to look away from it out of politeness. I applied that instinct to my own life for the first time in 14 months. I didn't confront Adele. Not yet. I watched. I noticed that she and Marcus had opened a joint gym membership 8 months earlier, filed conveniently under family wellness on a shared card Marcus and I still held from our early marriage. I noticed hotel charges near her office, dated to days she'd told our mother she was working late for a client presentation. A client I later learned by simply asking a mutual colleague at a dinner party who didn't exist. I want to be honest. There was a version of me that wanted to burn it all down loudly, to scream in a parking lot, to call her the names that lived, briefly, hot and ugly, in the back of my throat. I let myself feel that version fully, in private, in my car, in the shower, in the quiet hour after midnight. I did not act from her. My father used to say, Solenne, anger is a good engine and a terrible driver. I let the anger fuel me. I did not let it steer. Instead, I built a folder. Dates. Screenshots. A calm, factual timeline, not for revenge, but because I have never once in my life made an important decision without understanding the full shape of what I was deciding about. I also began, quietly, to rebuild myself outside of the marriage. I opened an account only I could access. I called a lawyer, not to threaten anyone, but to know what my rights actually were, rather than what fear told me they might be. I started running again, early mornings, before either of them was awake to witness the person I was becoming without their permission. Adele called twice that week, cheerful, asking about Mom, about how I was holding up. I answered warmly both times. I have never been a good liar, but I have always been an excellent listener, and there is a kind of power in letting someone believe you know less than you do. I visited my mother 2 weeks after the funeral, ostensibly to help sort my father's study. Really, I went because I needed to sit in a room that still smelled like him and ask her a question I was afraid of answering myself. Did you know, I asked, holding one of Dad's old flannel shirts, about Marcus and Adele? My mother didn't look up from the drawer she was sorting. She has always processed hard things through her hands, folding, organizing, the way some people process through words. I suspected, she said. Your father did too. That undid something in me more than the affair itself had. Why didn't either of you say anything? Because it wasn't ours to carry into a truth for you, she said. Your father used to say some things a daughter has to discover on her own timeline, or she'll spend her whole life resenting the person who told her too soon. I sat with that for a long time. There was no anger in her voice, only a tired, practical grief, as if she'd been quietly mourning the version of our family that used to be true long before my father's heart gave out. She told me something else that afternoon, almost as an aside, folding one of his shirts into a perfect square. Adele had always measured her worth against mine. Not out of malice exactly, out of a wound so old my mother couldn't even locate its origin anymore. When we were girls, Adele would rearrange my room to make it better. When I got into university, she applied the following year to the same one, then transferred out within a semester. When I married Marcus, my mother said something had shifted in Adele that she'd never fully named, until now. That doesn't excuse her, my mother said quickly, seeing my face. Nothing excuses this. I'm only telling you so that whatever you decide to do next, you do it understanding the whole shape of it, not just the wound, but where it came from. I thanked her. I meant it. Understanding, I was learning, is not the same as forgiveness. But it is the ground you have to stand on before you can walk anywhere at all. I asked Adele to meet me at the small cafe near Dad's old office. Neutral ground. A place with no memories attached to either version of our sisterhood, the real one or the one I'd imagined. She arrived defensive before I'd said a word, which told me she'd been rehearsing her own defense for 2 weeks, same as I had been rehearsing my calm. I know, I said, before she could offer an opening excuse. 14 months. The gym membership. The hotel near your office. I'm not here to yell at you. Her face went through several weather systems. Panic, then something like relief that the performance could finally end, then, briefly, an old-fashioned sisterly instinct to reach for my hand, which I did not accept. I never meant for it to become what it became, she said. It was the sentence people say, when they mean I liked how it made me feel more than I disliked what it cost someone else. I told her, calmly, that I wasn't interested in her explanation of how it started. I was interested in one thing only. Why, at every major juncture of my life, she had needed to stand exactly where I was standing. She didn't have an answer that satisfied either of us. She cried genuinely, I believe. I let her. I did not comfort her, and I did not gloat. I simply watched my sister confront, perhaps for the first time, the actual size of what she'd done, instead of the softened story she'd been telling herself. What happens now? She finally asked. Now, I said, I stop making room for you in the seats I save. I left the cafe before she could respond. Not dramatically. I paid for my coffee. I pushed in my chair. I walked to my car in the quiet, unhurried way of someone who has already done the hardest part of the conversation days earlier, alone, in her own head. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt lighter, in the specific way you feel after finally setting down something you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it had weight. Marcus and I finalized the divorce 4 months later. There was no courtroom shouting, no public unraveling, only a conference table, 2 lawyers, and a stack of papers that reduced 14 months of quiet betrayal into a series of tidy, signable lines. He tried, near the end, to say something almost tender. I never stopped respecting you, Solenne. I found I no longer needed his respect to know my own worth. I know, I said, and I meant it as neither cruelty nor comfort, only as a fact, stated plainly, the way I might note a figure in a report that no longer required my emotional investment to be true. I kept the house, not out of spite, but because I'd chosen it, every tile, every window, back when I still believed I was building something permanent. It felt right that it would go on standing, under my name alone, regardless of what else had turned out to be temporary. Adele and I did not speak for a year. Eventually she wrote me a letter, not asking for forgiveness exactly, but acknowledging, in her own careful handwriting, the shape of what she'd taken and what it had cost. I didn't respond right away. I read it 4 times over 4 different weeks, each time finding I was ready to hear a little more of it than the last. I did not reconcile with her fully. Some doors, once opened all the way, don't close back to their original frame. But I stopped locking her out entirely either. We speak now, occasionally, careful, honest, unhurried conversations that resemble nothing like the closeness we had as girls, but resemble, at least, the beginning of something true. My father used to say that the measure of a person isn't what happens to them, but what they choose to become in the aftermath. I think, finally, 2 years after burying him, I understood what he meant. 6 years have passed since that limousine door opened onto the two people I trusted most, standing together in a way that quietly ended one version of my life. I am 37 now. I run my own small advisory firm, built, brick by careful brick, in the years after the divorce, when I finally had room in my life for something that belonged only to me. I still keep my father's fishing photograph on my desk. I still hear his voice sometimes, in traffic, in difficult meetings, reminding me that anger is a good engine and a terrible driver. Marcus and Adele are together still, I'm told, in a quiet, guarded sort of way. The particular quiet of two people who built something on a foundation they know is cracked and spend their lives carefully avoiding the sound of it settling. I don't think of that limo often anymore. When I do, it isn't with rage. It's with a strange, distant tenderness for the woman I was in that moment, sitting in the front pew, holding a program with her father's photograph, saving a seat for someone who had already left her, without knowing yet how much stronger she would become for having been left. Last month, at a friend's wedding, I sat alone at the reception, comfortable in my own company in a way that once would have felt unthinkable. A kind man at my table asked, gently, if the seat beside me was taken. I looked at it for a long moment before answering. Not anymore, I said. But I choose carefully now who gets to sit there. He smiled and sat, and asked me nothing else that night. No explanations, no history, no old wounds to account for. Just two people, beginning something small and honest, in the quiet, ordinary way that real things begin. Some griefs bury themselves. Others, if you let them, teach you how to build. I chose, finally, to build.